Almost 25 years ago, President George H.W. Bush gave a speech in which he articulated his vision of a new world order. He described it as a new reality in which, quote, the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle. It would have been a world beyond geopolitics, which normally featured a chess-like calculation of self-interest aimed at weakening, if not defeating, one's opponents. Our guest tonight has recently published an essay entitled The Return of Geopolitics. And here he is now, Walter Russell Mead, Professor of Foreign Affairs and the Humanities at Bard College in New York State, and we're delighted to have you here on TVO.
It's great to be back.
Well, you say back because you're frequently a guest on this program, but almost always by satellite, so it's good to have you in the flesh.
No, it's actually good to be up here in Toronto.
Okay, let me try this first question about your piece in Foreign Affairs, The Return of Geopolitics, which I hope is not too much of a smart aleck question, but what happened to geopolitics before it returned?
Well, I think it was always there, really, but in the West in particular, we spent a lot of time not thinking about it. We assumed that, with the end of the Cold War, it wasn't just that history was over, but international competition of that old dog-eat-dog law, the jungle kind, was over. Everybody was going to live within the boundaries that they were assigned in 1990. When somebody didn't like Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, the whole world would unite and push them back in. But we were no longer going to face this the same great powers trying to redraw the map of the world.
So the New World Order lasted half an hour.
Well, it's still in some ways remarkable how little boundaries have changed since 1990. And I think what we've got, in the article I talk about the axis of weevils, that you've got some countries that don't like the way the world works now, don't accept the current state of geopolitics, but they don't feel militarily able to sort of confront the Western alliance head on. Rather, they're looking for sort of little ways to chip away at this post-Cold War order.
Let me put a quote to you from Secretary of State John Kerry from your country. In his response to Russia's actions in Crimea back in March, he said, quote, you just don't in the 21st century behave in a 19th century fashion by invading another country on completely trumped up pretext. Is he right about that?
Well, as a matter of fact, clearly no, because it's happened in Ukraine. But certainly he expresses very well, I think, the sense of shock and disbelief a lot of people felt when Russia did something this blatant.
Because it's just not supposed to be done these days that way, is it?
Well, it really isn't, and it is too bad that it's happening. I certainly don't want to be back in a world of geopolitics, in a world of invasions and war, but there we are.
But is he basically saying the geopolitical competition that we remember from back then really ought not to be the 21st century way of doing business?
When you think about the kind of weapons that are in the hands of countries these days and just how devastating all-out war could be in the 21st century, it's certainly a reasonable goal to try to keep great power war off the table.
Okay, here's me quoting you back to you. You wrote, Westerners should never have expected old-fashioned geopolitics to go away. They did so only because they fundamentally misread what the collapse of the Soviet Union meant, the ideological triumph of liberal capitalist democracy over communism, not the obsolescence of hard power. So in your view, was it a mistake to see the end of the Cold War as a harbinger of a better, more peaceful appeal to the better angels within us kind of a time?
I think it was, the fact is the Soviet Union was a monstrous creation. It was a dysfunctional society. It only took power because of ruthless terror and suppression. So it's a good thing that it went away. But we should never have expected that everyone would rejoice in that Russian nationalists, for example, even if they might have thought that the Soviet system had to go, Russian nationalists saw their boundaries move 500 miles closer to Moscow. Why would they like that? Why should we expect them to like that? So human nature didn't change when communism ended, and I think that was a mistake on our part.
I guess there were a lot of countries as well that did well in a bipolar world where you could play off one against the other and enrich yourself in the process. Fair to say?
That was a lot of fun for a lot of people. It was a great game. But it's not. Again, it's not just the Soviet Union. China continues to feel that its boundaries, the boundaries that are internationally recognized, are too small. It has its 9-dash line in the South China Sea. I think many people in China look at some of the land that the Tsarist Russia took from China in the 19th century. I don't think China is willing, that China may be pragmatically willing to live within a certain system of boundaries and international norms, but I don't think they think there's something sacred or holy about the boundaries that existed at the end of the Cold War.
Okay, since you've mentioned China, let me ask you about 3 countries which are, I'm not sure what the right word to use here is, at the very least irritants, at the most real deep concerns for the Western world going forward. Russia, China, and Iran. You've described them as revisionist powers. What are they trying to revise?
Well, each of those powers has sort of 2 fears in common, or rather a fear and a hope. The fear is that they see real hostility from the West toward their form of government. I don't think either the Ayatollah, President Putin, or President Xi has any doubt what would happen if a spontaneous democratic revolution really did start taking place in their country. The West would cheer. If we thought it would help, we would send in support and assistance. If these governments tried to close down the internet and isolate their dissidents, and we had ways of keeping their dissidents in touch with each other, we would do what we could do. Mm-hmm. So they have, they're not wrong to see that the global status quo is a threat to their status quo. So that's a common fear. The common hope is in every case, they don't think the 1990 settlement of the Cold War, post-Cold War reality gave them everything they wanted. The Iranians believe that by history, culture, power, depth of civilization, and many other reasons, they really ought to be the paramount power of the Middle East. They particularly think that if you look at the power of Shia Islam, the oil-rich eastern province of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, parts of Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran, that the leading Shia power should be, by rights, the world's leading petropower. And they see that they are a world power that's being denied their rightful place in the sun. And from their point of view, it's a hateful coalition of Sunnis like the Saudi Wahhabists, who are their religious enemies, the Israelis, who they see as a geopolitical threat and an irritant of deep proportions, and the United States, that they have a long list of grudges. They see their 3 worst enemies combined in what looks to them like a plot to keep Iran from the stature and the prestige and power that Iran should, in their mind, have. So they're not going to, they see absolutely no reason to willingly collaborate in the maintenance of a world order, which from our point of view is actually not a bad thing. For the Russians, again, you have the territorial settlement of the Cold War. A lot of Russian-speaking people no longer live on Russian soil. You have the Russian speakers of Ukraine. President Putin has has annexed Crimea. At least that's what he calls it. But you in Latvia and Estonia, you have Russian speakers. But also, Russia's understanding of its geopolitical situation is that to see NATO in the former Baltic states, to see Ukraine attempting to take a genuinely independent course and even join the European Union and not Russia, this is an affront to everything that for many patriotic Russians that the world should be about.
They feel surrounded.
Right. They feel surrounded, they feel endangered. And I think also for President Putin, there is a sense of time pressure. Russia is not getting stronger in the long run. If you look at the consolidation of the European Union on one side, and you look at China's rise on the other side, and then you look at the sort of Islamic resurgence to Russia's south, the world is not getting more propitious for Russia. And I think Putin sees an opportunity now at a time where maybe the West is distracted, the U.S. is sort of tired of being involved in all of this trouble around the world. I think in Russia, a Russian patriot might say, if not now, when? We have a better chance to reshape the world now than we will in 5, 10, or 20 years. Now is the time for us to move.
Let's do the third one of that triad. How about China? What do they want?
China wants, it wants the territories that it thinks rightly belong to it. That would include Taiwan. That would include a very large chunk of the South China Sea. But also China is very concerned about what it sees as Japan remilitarizing and linking itself ever more deeply with the United States. In the West, we looked at the change in Burma, where the military regime began to open up. I mean, there's some problems now in Burma with the Rohingyas and so on, but nevertheless, there's been a political opening. The Chinese look at this mostly geopolitically and see that Burma, which used to be a Chinese ally, is now sitting around making good friends with Japan, the United States, India, and other countries. That's right on China's border. They wonder whether we might not have similar plans for North Korea, and indeed it's likely that in North Korea they've been looking at what happens in Burma, where a dictatorial socialist regime shows itself willing to shift allegiance, open up some on human rights, and suddenly that money is flooding in from the West. That's a little bit of a threat to China, too.
Speaking of money flooding in, I'd like to get your take on what many have weighed in on, this 30-year, $400 million gas deal, $400 billion gas deal between China and Russia. How do you read that?
I read that in a couple of ways. One is, I think Russia met China's price rather than China meeting Russia's price, so that this is, it's I think a business proposition for both sides, but also both sides definitely wanted to make a show of support. They've been kicking this deal around for years, and there's a certain commonsensical thing. Russia has a ton of gas in Central Asia and no place to put it, and China needs a lot of gas. Sooner or later, it would make sense for these two to reach some kind of agreement.
But is this more than a business deal?
Well, doing it now is a way of both countries demonstrating a kind of an independence of the West and being willing to basically say to the United States, you know, you're unhappy about Ukraine. We're not unhappy about Ukraine.
But do you see this as more than a business deal? Is it the beginning of a strategic alliance of sorts?
Look, I think China and Russia have been, in a sense, trying to build a strategic alliance against the United States since 1949. And it didn't work even when they were both communists. I think there are a lot of obstacles. They have a lot of interest in conflict and so on. However, they do share a common interest in undermining and chipping away at American power. So that as long as the big subject on the table is American opposition to their mutual designs, they will from time to time find ways to work together.
You will remember more than a decade ago, your friend Robert Kagan described the relationship between America and the European world as Americans are from Mars and the Europeans are from Venus, in as much as they could not abide the notion of military intervention. Is this still the way?
Well, it's arguably a lot of Americans have been moving to Venus, immigrating to Venus. And our defense budget, while maybe not completely Venusian, is a lot less Martian looking than it used to be. But I think the thing to look at here is maybe that we in the West, when we've been not paying attention to geopolitics and to Russia's European interests, I think we've missed a few possibilities here. For example, it takes unanimous consent of the NATO alliance to make a number of important decisions. Russia would really need to have only one friend in NATO to have an effective veto power on a lot of things that we do. In the same way, if you look inside the European Union, its politics are very complicated. but there are all kinds of interesting ways that a relatively small number of countries can create blocking minorities on a number of European initiatives. I think the Russians are looking, there are countries like Hungary, in a different way Slovakia, quite possibly if the Russians succeed in building their influence in southwestern Ukraine, we could see Bulgaria and Romania falling more deeply into kind of commercial relations. Greece and Cyprus already, there are a number of interesting connections between them. You can see a place coming where Russia would actually be able to wield significant influence inside the EU and inside NATO. And this would cause a number of problems for us in the West that I think we have not really thought about.
Would you be deeply concerned about that?
I would. Well, here, I mean, some things maybe are not so important, but here's a way in which Russia could create a real crisis for NATO and for the United States. Suppose in some of the neighborhoods or areas of Estonia or Latvia where there are a lot of Russian-speaking people, many of whom watch Russian television and some of whom presumably are not all that happy with their national governments. Suppose a bunch of 20-something young Russian-speaking men start appearing, not, they say, Russian military, and yet they appear to be both very well trained and unusually well armed.
Where have I seen this movie before?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so suddenly you might see, without a shot being fired or an army officially crossing a frontier, you might see parts of the territories of NATO countries no longer under the effective control of their national government. Now, here's an interesting question. Would NATO then be willing to start a shooting war to restore Estonian or Latvian control over their own territory?
That's a scary thought.
Well, I think we have not on our side, I think, spent enough time gaming out the possibilities. I'm not predicting that Putin is about to do something like this, but I certainly hope that the authorities in the West are doing the things necessary to put that beyond reach. My point is that we in the West have tended to say, there's really nothing Russia can do. Who cares what they think? We know they're stewing and they're unhappy. So what, right? On the Russian side, I think they've spent a lot of time thinking, okay, maybe we don't have the best hand and the best cards in the world, but how do we play our hand as effectively as possible? They may understand their options better than we do and in a way that we don't. So I think we need to raise our game. I'm not saying, go on DEFCON 5 and huge military forces on the frontier and strategic bombers over, that's not what this is about. Russia is not a great power peer competitor of the United States. It is a much weaker country than the Soviet Union was, but it has more capacities than many of us in the West have been willing to think about, and it's time to just take a long, hard look and then take a few prudent, thoughtful, reasonable steps just to make sure that things don't get out of hand.
Let's do one more on Germany. Angela Merkel, the chancellor there, and business leaders have been hearing from the average German, don't be too tough on Putin. Are they reevaluating their relationship with the West and with Russia?
I think Angela Merkel, having grown up in East Germany, is not a sentimentalist where Russia is concerned. And she remains by far and away the most powerful politician, most popular politician in Germany. Indeed, one might argue the most powerful person in Europe.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't think it's that, but I do think that the Germans, and I don't think this is wrong of them or stupid, or don't want a gratuitous fight in their own backyard. Right. However, Germany cares what the Baltic republics and what Poland think about things. Germany cares that foreign investors feel safe and secure when they go into those countries and make investments. Many of those investors are Germans. Many German companies, their supply chains are involved, not just with Russia, but with Poland and the Baltic states. So what the Germans are interested, I think, is fundamentally what Americans and Canadians are also interested in that part of the world, which is security and stability. So the Germans are worried that if we rock the boat too hard or too dramatically, we might cause the very thing we're trying to avoid, and some kind of all-out confrontation. I don't think that's a stupid idea. I think you can take it too far. I think you can, in a sense, let's put it this way, I think we shouldn't all be rushing to emulate Gerhard Schroeder and get a job working for Putin with Gazprom.
At the gas company.
Yes, but I think the Germans are in a typically slow, cautious German way, are working their way toward a reasonable position.
I'm going to beg the control room for 2 more minutes because I want to ask one more question here. Again, we talked about Robert Kagan earlier. He's got a piece out in the New Republic in which it's called "Superpowers Don't Get to Retire." And I wonder whether you think the United States of America still has the confidence and the desire to be the leaders of the free world, as we have regarded you for the last, almost a century.
To be absolutely candid, Americans are lazy. We don't want to do anything more than we have to do. If you think about September the 10th, 2001, no one in the United States was thinking, oh, let's go occupy Afghanistan. What fun that would be. But I think what happens is that every now and then, when Americans do, we get tired, we get frustrated. Those people out there that no matter, we can give them foreign aid and they won't do right. We can bomb them and they won't do right. What are we supposed to do? It's very frustrating. And so we say, the heck with it all for a while. But then what happens is if we take our eye off the ball, somebody will come along at some point and whack us on the head with a 2x4. And then we sort of get, wait a minute, what is this? And if you look at the history of the 20th century, that's very much what happened. The United States wasn't active trying to stop Hitler until Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and then suddenly we go all over the place. After World War II, we just wanted to go home. We didn't want to have troops in Europe. It was only when Stalin really just was relentlessly solidifying communist dominion, and you had the possibility that France and Italy might go communist, the Chinese communists were making gains, then Americans woke up at that point and got organized. So in some ways, President Putin may be giving us a bit of a wake-up call now, and there's certainly more talk in the United States this summer about, maybe we need to get a little bit more active, maybe we need to be proactive in the world rather than reactive, that I think already we're seeing a bit of a change.
Gotcha. It's always great to have you here on TVO. Walter Russell Mead from Bard College in New York State. Thanks so much.
Good to be here.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.